Welcome, everybody, to the episode 14 of ArborGen TreeLines Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Jeffries, and I'm joined today by Dr. David Clabo from University of Georgia's Warrenell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And today we're going to be jumping into a topic, I would say a hot topic, but that would be a little play on words. But we're going to jump into spring silviculture and what's changed and what actually works today. We're going to talk about in this discussion, we're going to go from site prep to spacing and talk about how every decision in pine silviculture impacts long-term value. We're going to break down how the modern practices are backed by the science and real-world experiences. And we're also going to talk about helping landowners become more productive and create a higher valued forest on their property. And Dr. Clabo, that's basically what it's all about for private landowners, is creating more value for their investment, getting a better return on their investment. But with that, I'm going to let you give a little introduction to yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you came from, and what you like to do.
All right. Appreciate the invitation to join today, Paul. As he said, my name is David Clabo. I'm an associate professor of silviculture outreach with the University of Georgia Warrenell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. I'm based on the UGA Tifton campus, so I'm in South Georgia. I'm about 3 hours and 20 minutes from main campus, but been here going on 8 years now. My expertise is in silviculture, forest management. I do a lot with forest regeneration, forest herbicides. We've got some productivity studies. I'm mainly with my appointment in extension, but I also have a smaller research appointment. So a lot of the research kind of feeds directly into the extension programming and publications, that sort of stuff that I do. It's a good job with a lot of variety.
Now, did you grow up in Tifton?
No, I'm from Tennessee originally. So I grew up in East Tennessee, from Gatlinburg area, right across the street from the national park. There's where I grew up. So.
Are you serious?
Yes, sir.
Wow. Well, that's a different discussion for a different day that I'd like to get into. Most people want to move to that area, and I now understand why you went into forestry.
Exactly. Grew up in the woods quite a bit there. Yeah, hiking and camping.
Did your dad, was he or your mom employed there at the national park, or did they have any involvement? Or
actually, neither one of them were.
Right.
My mom was a school teacher, and so the elementary school I went to had a good connection with the National Park Service. A lot of custom field trips for students in each grade level.
Wow. And that probably is what led you or lit your fire, your passion that I'm sure you have, like I do, for forestry and everything outdoors and the environment.
Definitely contributed. Yes.
I can. Well, we'll have to share some stories about that later on. That might be another podcast that we go into. But, today we're going to be breaking down and talking about silviculture. Can you just give us, for our listeners out there that are listening to this, can you just give us a definition, just a layman's definition of silviculture and what it basically means?
Sure, yeah. So silviculture basically is the art and science of managing a forest from prior to any tree planting or natural regeneration all the way up through the final harvest to meet kind of landowner and society objectives and needs.
Right.
I mean, it can include planting, tending operations, all that, everything that occurs kind of from when those trees originate until they're cut or die or whatever the case is.
Culture, meaning to grow, is basically growing trees, and
exactly.
that's what we do in forestry, and that's what we for a lot of private landowners out there that are blessed to have private timberland to manage. That's what they want to do. And if you're still managing the pine stands the way you did 10 to 20 years ago, it might be a time for a reset. And that's what we're going to walk through in this episode of how silviculture has evolved, where it came from, where it's going, and what you can do, how you can use it to basically meet your objectives for your private timberland. So, we're going to go into a little bit We'll probably talk about some genetics, some herbicide, and we'll talk about different spacing. But let's just go ahead and talk about at the beginning. We've talked about what silviculture is, but what is silviculture today? Can you give us the key components of what silviculture today is basically includes?
Yeah, that's a pretty broad topic, but I would say civiculture today has to be more precise probably than it has been historically, just based on your location. So that entails what timber markets are like in your area, if it's a public or private ownership, landscape characteristics. So what's the site like where you're trying to manage for a particular stand condition, all those sorts of things. But yeah, we I think we really have to be more precise with tailoring management to what's needed to meet objectives on each site nowadays.
Right. And is there one prescription, silvicultural prescription that to meet all to go across like can you say there's one silviculture prescription for all sites?
No, I don't
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah. Every one of them's different, correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I get calls sometimes from landowners and the first question is what should I spray my site with? What chemical should I use to prepare my site for planting this coming winter? And, it always goes back to the answer, I think, to every forestry question that has ever been asked. And the first answer is it depends.
Yep. It always depends. Yep.
It depends what type site. What are you looking at? What's your soils? What's your species composition of your
Mm,
competition that's coming up there?
exactly.
Vegetation control. What type of site do you have? Is what planting practice do
Mhm.
you need? For your site? And it has always been the answer of, well, it depends. I mean, you don't want to obviously waste money, and there is the opportunity to waste a lot if you get,
Definitely.
doing things the wrong way, doing things that did not necessarily need to be done, just practices. So give us in your how long have you been in civil culture? How long have you been studying civil culture?
Well, given my college years, let's see, I guess about 18, 19 years.
Okay. So, I mean, you're a young guy. We were talking about that earlier before we started the recording. You're a young guy. You're looking at, I know my son, I have a 26-year-old son. And when I say things about, when I talk about doing things around the farm and he rolls his eyes and says, Dad, you're doing that the old way. Give us a little bit of an idea of the old way. When you started, you said 15, 18 years ago, when you started working in this, give us an idea of what silviculture looked like back then, or give us an idea of what silviculture looked like in the when it first started.
So, I mean, if we go back, I'll go back to when it first started. I mean, typically, say like 50s, 60s, when pine seedlings for planting became more available. A lot of the times it was just mechanical site prep, maybe a burn if the forester thought one was needed for the site. And then in the 70s is when some herbicides became more widespread with availability and use.
And what type of herbicides were those first ones? I mean,
So like 2,4,5-T and
right.
things that are outlawed nowadays. So
Yes.
and then I think early 80s is when we got a lot of our more modern herbicides that became
Hmm.
available for forestry use, like imazapyr. Glyphosate became more widespread then because I think it was invented in around the mid 70s. And then we had like herbaceous weed control herbicides like sulfometron and metsulfuron that became more available kind of early to mid 80s time frame. So that was really a game changer when those products came onto market because could get much more specific with our chemical site prep applications and kind of tailor those to the vegetation compositions on site. And normally with mechanical, I mean, it's still very useful for some sites, but there usually has to be some sort of limiting site condition, like
Right.
poor drainage for some of our lower coastal plain sites where bedding is needed, as an example. Maybe a site that's got a lot of logging slash from, say, a storm or leftover after a harvest. You might use something like shearing or root raking, something like that. But normally we tell folks to limit the mechanical unless it's something that's absolutely needed. So like poorly trained soil, compacted soil with say like subsoiling or ripping.
Right.
those types of activities. So just because
Now,
to
why would
reduce the
you
cost.
I was gonna ask, that was gonna be my next question is why would you tell somebody to limit the amount of mechanical site prep for, getting a site ready? So you said it would just be to try to help with the cost.
Yes, yeah, just with diesel prices the way they are and
Right,
operators, their per hour charges. I mean, it's the mechanical site prep costs have increased the most since I started over anything else.
right, right. So, that was where it started. You mentioned a lot about the chemicals there and the chemicals that were used, but also what was going on in that time. And I have a great chart, that I use in my presentations that talk about, the additive impacts of silviculture in forestry along with and
Mhm.
how it goes up and how as you add on, silvicultural practices and they are a compounding addition on top of each other, your
Yes,
production as far as tons per acre or, your yield, what we call yield per acre grows exponentially as you go across and you continue to add those things. So as it started back in the day, people really relied on natural regeneration
yes,
on a lot of stands because the industry, forest technology had not basically developed at that time. So, starting back in the 90s and 50s, before all of this was developed, it was mainly, we remember the horror stories of when they were coming through and they would just clear cut a piece of property and walk away from it
exactly.
with no preparation, with no thought about the next generation or the next stand that was coming back. And they really now things have developed. Site prep has developed to a point where there is a lot. It's like farming. I mean,
Mhm.
a farmer, you don't see a farmer go out into an agriculture field and harvest his crop at the end of the growing season and then just come back and expect the same crop to come back the next year. So, I guess it is would you say that it is very important for the private landowner or the forest manager consultant to get it right at the beginning of the stand with his silvicultural practices?
Oh yes, for sure. Because really, once those trees are in the ground, there's less options you can use to ameliorate a situation that's going to lead to stand conditions you don't want, whether that's poor survival rates or a lot of hardwood competition, something like that. Which usually those
Right,
go hand in hand. But
right.
yes, there's definitely more options at site prep before trees are in the ground to get things
Okay.
right and ensure your best chance of success, no doubt.
Right. So going back and talking about, we have chemical. Let's just start out. Okay, let's paint this picture right now. We've got and you and I are going to talk about this. We've just got a fresh clear cut, in let's say there in South Georgia where you're at right now, and we've got a fresh clear cut, and a landowner has called up Dr. Clabo and said, "Hey, I need to know what I need to do out here to make sure that I've got a good stand coming back." Let's just walk through your process. If you went out and looked at a site and let's say the first thing your decision was, okay, are we going to do mechanical or chemical sap prep? Can you tell me how you would evaluate that stand of which one to use?
Yeah. So probably first ask about land use history.
Hmm.
Was the site, you said it was a clear cut, right?
Yes, it's just a clear cut. It was a former pine plantation, and it came
Okay.
time to harvest it. We've just put them on the ground. Got a great price for the saw logs, and we put it on the ground. And this individual landowner has come back and says, "Dr. Claybo, I want to know what I need to do."
Okay. So yeah, I would inquire a little bit about the land use history. Was this like an old CRP planting? Was it an ag before that? And that can kind of give you an idea of woody competition and but also
Hmm.
herbaceous competition that might come back and let you know a little bit about some of the site prep that might be needed. I'd inquire about the soil series present. That can help you decide,
Why is
is it
that
poorly
important?
yeah, if it's poorly drained or not. You can know if maybe if it's a little bit more prone to compaction depending on that soil texture,
Right.
whether or not, say, subsoiling or something like that might be needed for mechanical site prep. And then if it's a poorly drained soil, it's most likely going to need to be bedded unless the old beds could be reused. I have heard of some folks doing that in some cases. I would say that's
So
common, but
Yeah, and I get that question a lot too. And let's go back and talk about that subsoiling that you just
Hmm.
mentioned there. Back in, as my grandparents used to say, back in the good old days, every when families were homesteading properties and they were farming land, just about every square inch of land in the southeast, unless its topography was just so steep they couldn't do it, was either grazed or farmed.
Exactly.
And you and I both know that the old tillage implements of yesteryear in agriculture, it had a tendency to create a problem below the soil's surface. Can you explain a little bit about that to our listeners?
Yeah, so years and years of farm machinery going over the same ground can cause an issue with compaction in the first few inches of the soil profile.
But I thought tillage equipment was made to basically stir the soil up and make it more make it better.
Well, it depends. So that compaction can be deeper sometimes,
Mhm.
like say within the first couple of feet, 18 inches, anyways. But if it's a site that had, say, livestock on it for years and years, then that compaction can be a little more shallow to the ground. Normally, with subsoiling, we recommend going to a depth of, say, like 15, 18 inches. It usually
Right,
takes a pretty high horsepower tractor. You want to do it during dry conditions like what we've got in South Georgia right now, typically done, say, during the spring months. And then you do those rips or trenches in the soil with your between row planting width. So say if you wanted 10 feet or 12 feet between the rows, that's how often you'd make an interval with a trench or a rip. And then it's good to let those sit through several rain events over the summer and into the fall before you plant the trees to allow some soil settling into those. And the whole purpose of the rip or the trench is just to fracture that hard pan in the soil to allow the
right,
tree roots to grow through, and you'll get better root development, especially with the taproot on a pine with that type of site prep. So it's can be very important for some sites. I've seen on sites where trees where they didn't rip beforehand and it looks like the taproot's just going sideways when it hits that hard pan in the soil. It can be called a plow pan, but there's also natural ones called fragipans or durapans in some soils. So
right.
they can occur naturally in some soil types. They're not common really in the coastal plain, but some areas in the southeast on our more upland soils have those occasionally.
Right,
And
right.
it's really one of the most important mechanical site prep tools we have for soil types where they're needed.
Well, that's what I tell the people that call and ask me, is, that mechanical pan that's about 18 inches below the soil surface, that was the size of your average disc blade back in the day,
Mm.
and everybody back in the day used a disc harrow. Whatever their term for it was a disc harrow or a disc or something, but those disc blades were about 18 to 20 inches in diameter.
Uh,
And that was about their average size. And people don't think, oh, they think, oh, it's stirring the soil, that's churning the soil. But at the same time, that's also a weight that is riding across that soil horizon that is just below that disc blade that can't get churned, and it's causing that mechanical pan, and
that just happens year after year. Yeah.
exactly, and yes, and then the livestock walking on top of it, or the hay, whatever grass, variety of grass you're using for your
Hmm.
hay production causes a lot of hay equipment to be riding across the top of it. But yes, I mean the mechanical site prep, it can get expensive, but there are places where we just absolutely need it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what about chemical site prep? You got this clear cut, or you're going to go out there, you're going to tell him about what mechanical site prep he might need. We talk about he might need a subsoiling. What about his chemical?
So for chemical, we pretty much recommend chemical on almost every site. I wouldn't say 100%, but probably 99% anyways. But
99.9.
yeah, exactly. And the reason for that is just was the best option to control vegetation without disturbing the site. Mechanical wood, you don't have the potential soil movement issues or compaction, and you can kill the root system of the competing vegetation using systematic herbicides that are typically foliar absorbed, but they can also be absorbed from the soil depending on what you use. And killing that root system and trying to prevent resprouting is going to be critical to to ensuring early soil water availability for your planted pines.
Now, is there one herbicide that's good for everything?
There's some that are good for a lot of situations, yes. So some of our more broad spectrum herbicides are really good at controlling a lot of species, but they don't control everything. So
Right.
normally we recommend a tank mix of two or more products. Usually it's only two, but sometimes it may be three, but usually it's only two products that we'll recommend for a tank mix.
Now, is the chemical site prep mix, let's say the landowner on this clear cut that you're managing there that you're looking at, let's say this landowner has decided he doesn't want to go back with pine trees. He may want to go back with hardwoods. Would he
Okay.
be using a different chemical site prep mix, tank mix for that management aside from what he would be using, say, for pine trees?
So with hardwoods, they're of course going to be more sensitive to most of our herbicides that we'd use in site prep. So we normally recommend a little bit lower rates and maybe an earlier application timing before when you think you're going to plant. Just especially if you're using soil active herbicides to give that herbicide more time to break down in the soil and limit the potential for phytotoxic effects with your planted hardwoods.
Right.
But I mean, you can use, say, like an imazapyr glyphosate tank mix like you would for pines with hardwoods, but you're typically going to lower that imazapyr rate a little bit and try to do it, say, at least 3, maybe 4 months or more before you think you're going to plant.
Right. And that's because some herbicides, correct me if I'm wrong, some herbicides have a soil activity period that they can stay
Yes.
and stay active.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, like a Mazapyr is kind of notorious for that. It's our main and one of our best herbicides for, say, like a late summer into fall application period.
Uh-huh.
And then hexazonone is another one we use occasionally, especially on sandier soils in the coastal plain that has a spring application and it also has soil activity. Kind of our two base chemicals that we use at different times of the year both have pretty significant soil activity and really soil texture, your weather between application and planting, all that kind of impacts how quickly that herbicide will break down in the soil.
Okay. Yeah. So it's, again, it goes back to the age old answer of, well, it depends.
It depends, exactly.
It depends. Well, what about, do you ever encounter landowners that say, hey, I want to cut corners on my site prep, or I may not want to go with this heavy of a rate. Can I cut that back a little bit? Do you ever advise that for anybody? Or would you say you get what you pay for? If you cut corners, you may end up wishing you hadn't later on.
Typically, it's you get what you pay for. And like I said, some folks may want to just rely on like a release treatment after the trees are already in the ground because you typically use less herbicide or fewer types of herbicide for release treatment because you have to use something that's safe to use over the top of the tree. Usually, you just don't get as good a control if you go that route compared to if you did like the standard herbicide rates at site prep before the trees are in the ground. So
Right.
that's one case I've heard about folks considering a few times was just, we'll save money on herbicide and not use as much, say, with just a release treatment versus the higher rates that are used during site prep.
What's the
And
difference
usually,
in a release treatment and a site prep treatment?
so release treatments for, say, your planted trees are already in the ground and you notice you've got a competition problem pretty early on. And usually it's a woody competition issue because woody plants tend to be more of an issue throughout the rotation than, say, your herbaceous plants. So like the grasses and broadleaf weeds. And so with woody control, with, say, like loblolly pine, you can do an early woody release treatment with something like a Mazapyr over the top
Right.
after that first growing season if you notice there's an issue. But you're not using as much imazapyr per acre as you would during site prep, so you may not get the same level of control.
Now, what is your imazapyr going to control? What type of species is it going to control?
So it controls most of your hardwood species and woody pines.
Okay.
There's a few exceptions to that. There's some species that are, say, like leguminous species that won't control. So, like examples of that might be, say, like an invasive would be kudzu or something like mimosa or say locust. Some of
Right.
those more leguminous
Those
woody
were the 2 I
species.
was hoping that was the 2
Yeah.
I was hoping that you would mention there is
Okay. Yeah.
mimosa and locust trees because that
Yeah.
imazapyr is not going to, it's not gonna touch those guys, but I tell you one thing that imazapyr is good for controlling, and that is sweet gum and
Exactly.
your other hardwood species, sycamore, yellow poplars, stuff like
Mhm.
that. It is good if you're wanting to control those species for a pine replant, and hey, let's face it, we're in the business of genetics. We're in the business of producing pine seedlings, genetically improved seedlings here at ArborGen. When it's not a small investment, it's not where as used to be, that used to be I guess the lowest cost part of the whole process. Now it's not, because there's a
Exactly.
lot of involvement that goes in producing these better genetics for to meet the objective of the landowner. So you really, your cost versus your long-term return on investment is something that you've got to pay attention to as a landowner, because you really get what you pay for.
Exactly. Yep. And
You know,
normally I tell folks, hey, if you're thinking about investing more in tree seedlings, I would probably invest more in site prep too, and
right.
try to plant your better genetics on your better sites too, so they can kind of meet their full potential.
Right, I get that same wow, we must be talking to the same people, there, David, but I get that same question a lot. Is I'll be presenting to a group and somebody in the back will raise their hand and they'll go, "Hey, if I plant these, super quality trees, these MCP, mass control pollinated seedlings of y'all's, do I still need to do all the site prep that I would have done without planting those?" And I instantly, my usual response is, it's more important that now that
Exactly.
you do that, more than important than ever, because that is not, you've got to give those trees the best opportunity you can give them to grow and meet their genetic potential.
You need to be all in with your management, basically.
Exactly. You need to be doing everything you can. Well, tell us about, what does chemical control, what are some of the things that it can help with as far as that first year? Let's say, all right, that landowner we were talking about, I gave you that example. He's out there, she's out there, they've got their property and they've called Dr. David and they're like, look, I want to make this right and I want to get it done right. What are the benefits that that control is going to give them for those seedlings on the forefront?
So yeah, the big one, especially early on, is going to be just more soil water availability. Just think
Right,
about it. If there's more vegetation out there pulling up more water from the soil, that's going to be more detrimental to those pine seedlings. Think how they're being introduced to a new environment. They're going to probably have a little bit of transplant shock there in that first spring when they're out, especially if it's a dry spring like we're having this year. And the more water availability for those planted pine seedlings, the better off they're going to be. And then also you got to think about things like growing space and shading. A lot of the times the competing vegetation has an established root system that's going to enable them to grow more quickly early on than the
right,
pines. So that competing vegetation can overtop and kind of shade out those pines fairly quickly, especially on better sites. And so if that competition's removed, that just gives those planted pines that much more of a chance to thrive and get a good stand down the road.
right. So it all basically, all of that, we can wrap all of that up into, with the site prep, you're going to get better survival rates. You're going to get earlier growth and you're going to have more stand uniformity, because let's face it, in my background, I tell landowners the number one killer of hardwood seedlings, and really the number one killer of all seedlings, would be competition that first year.
Exactly.
And you're trying to put something in the ground that has not captured that site. It has no root. It's got to start growing. It's got to start putting roots into a new site, and it's competing with other plants that already are established and already have
Exactly.
that root growth captured. And I'm
It's a
glad
tough
you mentioned
environment.
it. It is. It is. It's a turf. I tell people also that, these seedlings are growing in a nursery and they're growing basically in the Garden of Eden, as they would think of
Exactly.
it.
I tell
Because
folks something similar.
yeah, I mean, they're getting everything they need. They've got their buddies right there next to them. I mean, it is absolutely, euphoria, because if they need a little bit extra nitrogen, we've got nursery managers that can detect that and they can put that in the fertilizer. If they need a little extra of this, if they need a little extra, and then you're taking them out in the fall and then planting them what I call their final resting place, where they're going to spend the rest of their lives, and they've
Uh,
got to then fight it out. And let's face it, if they're fighting with a neighboring yopon and a neighboring plant that already has captured the site, or an invasive plant, it can be kind of difficult.
Definitely. Yeah. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a tough world for them when they leave the nursery and are placed at their final resting site. I like that
Yes.
the way you put that.
Yeah, exactly. And whether or not, that final resting time, if you don't get the site prep right, it can be a very short-lived time.
It can be, yes.
So you can, there's people out there that say, "Oh, you can skip on chemical and catch up later," but that's really risky. I mean, that's
It
that's
is.
not a that's not a good idea. And what about these people that also say, "Hey, I've just harvested this site." Let's say, for instance, your landowner there in South Georgia that you're looking at the property. They've just harvested the site, and it is really clean. Let's face it. When the logger leaves, you're seeing a lot of bare ground out there. You're not seeing any of that competition coming up. Is that competition still there when that logger leaves and the site looks clean?
Yes, it's still there, present as root systems, rhizomes, stored seed in the seed bank. All that's in the soil.
Right,
And so typically folks have that condition. We'll say to wait a little bit and allow some resprouting, new germinus to develop. And that enables the herbicides to be more effective and control that vegetation long term. Because you're thinking about this all on a very long term basis. You're trying to do this treatment early on before the trees are planted to give your planted trees the best chance of long-term success. And so we'll normally say, especially with woody vegetation, let it resprout and get, say, a couple of feet tall at least, have some foliage on it, and then apply those herbicides at the proper timing, say late summer into the early
right,
fall, when most absorption is going to occur and that herbicide is going to be translocated down to the root system.
right.
So
When would you think is the best time? What would be your expertise? What's the best time to apply chemical site prep?
like I said, yeah, once you've got resprouting, say vegetation a couple feet tall, and if you're using it, kind of also depends on the herbicides you're using, but say imazapyr is your base chemical, and then what other chemicals you're adding to that, say like triclopyr, glyphosate, or whatever. Normally, kind of say starting mid August or mid July through leaf color change, depending on kind of your latitude and weather conditions, is going to be the best time for that type of tank mix. But like I
Right,
mentioned with hexazinone, it's more spring application, so it's
right,
best to apply it after leaves first fully emerge in the spring. It has to have some rainfall to activate it. Uh, but again, not
right.
not nearly as many people use it as the imazapyr base chemical.
So, I run into several situations to where people will say, "Oh, we want to do a late site prep. We want it to get a carryover into that first year so that maybe that we can skip that woody release." And, my advice usually is to them that's not advisable because you want to get
Yeah,
a lot of those chemicals are soil active. And say if you're doing a hardwood planting, you want to get that chemical out there early in that
exactly.
growing season so that it can do its thing and have already really been absorbed, done its work, what it was designed to do, and be out of the way and out of the system by the time you go and stick the trees in the ground. Because you can get some residual negative impacts on pine seedlings as well from a
Exactly.
late spray. Well, I want to jump into something else that I get a question a lot about, and maybe you can clear up because it's really not something that I'm too clear on, and that's fertilization in forestry. So let's say, for instance, that landowner that you're working with there comes and says, "Well, Dr. David, should I do a fertilization application out here on my newly planted trees?" And what's your take on fertilization, and what has the research shown here lately?
So fertilization can be very important for certain soil types. So an example for the coastal plain, and this would be pretty much throughout the Atlantic or Gulf coastal plains if you've got a soil with these characteristics. If you've ever heard of the Cooperative Research and Forest Fertilization System that University of Florida developed back in, I guess it was in the early to mid 1980s, but it's a soil classification guide. It's used to make species, deployment, and fertilization decisions for coastal plain soils. And if you look at their guide, those CRIF A soils, so those are soils that have an argillic or clay horizon, an increase in clay within 20 inches of the surface, and they're also poorly drained soils. Those soils tend to be very phosphorus deficient. And so if you planted loblolly on a site like that, because loblolly is kind of our most nutrient intensive species, requires the most nutrients. If you planted loblolly on a site like that, then you probably wouldn't have a whole lot of a stand down several years down the road, or it'd be a kind of a sickly looking stand that wasn't growing near its potential. So, like a nitrogen phosphorus fertilization, say within the second year after planting, just to make sure you've got good seedling survival after that first year. And also, you want to make sure you got good weed control. That can be very important on some soils, like those CRIF soils.
Right.
Most other soils, especially given current fertilizer costs, it's not going to be economical. Fertilizer costs, since some of these foreign wars have broken out, have really gone through the roof. So we're really not recommending fertilization
Right.
right now,
Right.
especially because you still have to pay the application costs as well, unless you're going to do that yourself. But most cases, whether that be mid rotation or at establishment, we don't recommend it nowadays, just because of the cost. But
Right.
certain soil types, it can really make a difference in productivity and whether or not you've got sort of an economic stand down the
So it
road.
still goes back to that answer that everybody gets is, well, it depends. What are some of the common fertilization products that are used in forestry if they are used? I heard, I commonly hear the phrase or the term DAP,
Yeah.
which is an acronym commonly used, or I commonly hear other combinations, but that's the one that is most common.
Yes. So DAP is mainly it's diammonium phosphate, but it's mainly applied for the phosphorus content, and then folks will often do say like a urea application for the nitrogen with that. But that does have some nitrogen in it. But that's probably the most commonly applied forestry fertilizer. There's also
And is it
MAP.
applied at the time of planting, or is it applied at the time a couple of years after planting? When would it be applied?
Normally, we suggest doing it, say, like that second year after planting, just to make sure you've got good survival and good weed control. And just think about it, if you're applying it, if there's a lot of weeds present, you're also going to be feeding the weeds present. So
Right,
you want to make sure you've got good weed control with any type of fertilizer application.
right,
But it can be applied at establishment or shortly thereafter, or say at mid rotation after a thinning. So that's kind of the two windows when it's used most frequently. And then there's other inorganic fertilizers like monoammonium phosphate, triple superphosphate that are mainly used for the phosphorus content. Uh, but then urea is probably the most commonly used fertilizer for the nitrogen.
I always recommend a soil test.
Yes.
Go by
Yeah, you
what go by what the soil test says.
And that's one thing we really haven't talked about with fertilization yet is the diagnostics you need to
Right,
do prior to even thinking about doing any type of fertilizer treatment. So you need to do your soil test, look at that soil phosphorus especially, and then maybe also the pH pretty closely. And then it's also good to do foliage test as well and
right,
look at all your macro and micronutrient content in that foliage. And those are normally done in the winter before pollen dispersion. So it's kind of a narrow window there when the trees are dormant before they start dispersing pollen, where you want to do that.
right, right. Well, that leads me into basically saying if you don't get the site prep right, if you don't get the if you don't get the competition controlled, doing a fertilization, you can't correct a bad
Yeah.
site prep mistake by fertilizing your way out of it because a
No.
lot of those, if you don't get those competing plants controlled, putting the fertilizer in the ground is just going to be feeding them, and you may not be feeding the target species that you're wanting to feed there because you made a mistake on the forefront. Well,
Exactly.
talking
The
again,
competition control. Yeah. The competition.
right. So competition control is probably priority one when it comes to
Yeah.
silviculture. So let's
Exactly.
talk about a little bit. Now we've got this landowner. We've addressed the site prep. We've addressed pre and post plant site chemical control, mechanical site prep. Whether he needed bedding, whether he needs subsoiling. Now we've gotten into we've gotten the site ready, just about ready. We've just about prepared the table. We're getting ready to put down the seedlings and everything. And then he or she comes back and says, "All right, Dr. David, what do I need to know about spacing and planting density? What's the magic number?" It's always a moving target. I hear some people that are still planting 622. I hear some people that have gone down to 400 trees per acre. What are you seeing? And what was traditional high density and then modern approaches?
Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of different facets to that to think about. Big one, of course, is going to be just what species are you going to plant. So, say with species like loblolly or even slash pine, where they have genetic improvement, you can get away with lower planting distance than say with like longleaf, where you want to plant a little bit higher density to ensure you get that good survival rate, because typically longleaf's not going to have quite the survival as especially loblolly.
Right.
And then also thinking about markets and kind of your objectives. Most places in the Southeast, we're kind of losing our small diameter wood product markets. If we can kind of strategize and maybe plant at a wider spacing, especially if we're looking more at, say, loblolly or slash, that can potentially move more trees into, say, chip and saw product classes by the time that stand needs to be thinned, which would be at an older age than say with what we would do with a typical pulpwood first thinning, pulpwood heavy first thinning.
Right. Right.
That's something really to think about. So your markets that you've got locally, and then yeah, just your objectives. I mean, are you trying to grow out much more valuable products? Is it more of an objective where you're just trying to store carbon? I mean, what that all kind of plays into it as well.
It all goes back to that landowner objectives, and as you mentioned there, it talks about, as we talk about all the time, the markets. Now, I get questioned, and I ask what's your markets like, and look, let's face it, there are some areas in the southeastern U.S. that they still do have some decent pulpwood markets. Even in those areas, if you go back and you plant a higher genetic tree that's going to grow and put and selected for higher yield and heavier weights, and that is part of the genetic selection. You can increase those, even if you are planting more trees per acre, you can increase that initial yield on that first harvest for pulpwood, and you can increase that. But it depends on your markets and your landowner objectives, and but especially if you're going to a lower density, what I have found and what most people are looking at is if they're going to a lower density, it is highly, highly important that you plant a better genetic because
Yes,
you're planting fewer trees and look, your margin of error window is
it is for
so,
sure.
it's not just how many trees you plant, but it's what those trees that you plant are capable of doing.
Yeah, you want those trees to have the best traits possible. Uh,
Right. Back in the day, I remember, my grandparents, they would go and they would plant, over 700 trees per acre. But it was simply because they did not have they only had the basic tree that they could pick and plant. And that's what
unimproved.
but they had pulp markets that could use those trees. And also on top of that, by planting all those trees, when they did cut out the defective trees that were never going to make a saw log, they would probably still have a stand worth growing on out for saw logs and poles. It never was a guarantee. With genetics the way they are today, and through selective crosses, you can have that guarantee of these trees are, barring some environmental impact, as you and I know, can always impact a stand, but barring some environmental impact, those trees are going to produce those higher quality stems to make those long lasting products like lumber and poles.
Yes.
So, that's just the role. We'll talk about that. We've talked about that. We've talked about chemical site prep. We've talked about mechanical site prep and how it is important to get it right at the beginning. We've talked about how, fertilization may or may not be a necessity and whether or not it will be a positive, investment on for the life of the stand. And then we've talked about the genetic and how it's changed and how people are looking at different densities and spacing and how all of that is impacting the ultimate goal and in creating value for the private landowner. So, can you just a little bit here as before we wrap up, tell us a little bit about what your science and your what the science and your research projects are showing and what you see coming on the
Yeah. So in recent years, we've been working on kind of a forest productivity project looking at updating site index and mean annual increment estimates for loblolly and slash pine in the coastal plain of Georgia, and then just loblolly in the Piedmont. And then we've also got a similar study for planted longleaf stands that were containerized stock. And so we're trying to update our kind of our growth and yield information available just to give landowners a better idea of kind of, hey, this is what modern forestry practices and genetics will do in terms of productivity, whether you're trying to figure out the site index or tons per acre per year growth. So that's some work I've been working on really since like 2020. And it's like these are 2-3 phase projects where you
Right.
get like a stretch of funding for 3 or 4 years, and then it's renewed if you're doing well on the project. And you go another 3 or 4 years. Kind of where we're going in the future. I think again we're going to try to be more precise with our silviculture prescriptions for specific site locations and site characteristics. I think that's always going to be something we're trying to improve. I think in some areas, if timber markets continue to go kind of the trajectory they're on, mixed stand management might be something more folks tend to look at, especially folks that private landowners that have fewer acres that they manage,
Right.
because it's a little more hands-off approach, not as intensive management in a lot of cases, or it doesn't have to be. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And that it might give landowners a little bit more flexibility, especially if you've got commercially or ecologically important pine and hardwood species in the same stand. So that might be one way we kind of go in the future. But yeah, I think a lot of it's just kind of in flux right now with just seeing how these timber markets go and kind of what that enables, especially private landowners to do.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, it's definitely a changing world. Talking
Mhm.
about that mixed stand management, we have talked about on this podcast, it's been more kind of directed to one species, but that's definitely the way some things are growing. That's a whole different, we could spend hours talking about, this and that and what we could be doing with that. But I think, the takeaway from today's podcast is you don't cut corners on site prep.
No.
It's a long-term investment. When you're deciding what to plant, you get a lot of landowners get one shot to get this thing right. And if you miss or make a mistake or you cut a corner or you save a couple of bucks per acre doing this over here instead of doing this, that can drastically impact your return on your investment in a negative way. And then match your spacing to your goals. And early investment always pays off later. Early investment,
It does.
it's like investing in stocks or anything else. If you invest early on, you can definitely see the payoff, and be intentional on what you do. Be intentional on the site prep you use. Be intentional on the seedlings you use, the genetics that you use. And here's where, I want to send it home is if anybody has any questions or would like to ask you anything about, is there a way that they can contact you to send you a question and ask you, hey, Dr. David, what would you recommend? Or, just how can they get in touch with you?
Sure. I'm always glad to answer questions or help folks along in the management process. Yeah, my email is david.clabo, that's CLABO at UGA.edu. Also, folks can feel free to call my office phone. It's area code 229 and then 386-3672. I'm an extension faculty, so we're here to help folks.
Exactly, and that's exactly what extension faculty is there for, is to help landowners. I have a background in extension as well, and if any of you out there have any other questions about what we've discussed today on this episode about silviculture and how it's changing, you can always reach out to us at ArborGen. Visit us at arborgen.com to find your regional reforestation advisor and get in contact with us. We'll be glad to help in any way we can. If we can't answer the question, we'll definitely kick it off to someone like Dr. David Clabo here with UGA's College of Forestry, and we'll get you the answer that you need and to best fit your goals and everything. And again, I want to thank you all for tuning in for this episode of the ArborGen TreeLines Podcast, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you again for joining us.